There was a time that Paul and I, despite appearances, were young pups. And we started at our law firm at about the same time. We were told, no matter what happens, even if you have to bribe some people, don't work for two particular fire-breathing dragon partners. You can't do it. One of them was named Howard Westwood. And we all lived in mortal terror the first day or two. Will we get assigned to Howard Westwood? Paul and I were in the library in our early days, and there was a microphone there, a loudspeaker. Mr. Tagliabue, go see Mr. Westwood immediately. And he jumped his 6'6" frame about 7 more feet and sat there for a while. And he finally pulled himself up and slithered out of the library to see Howard Westwood. Westwood's office is a bunch of Civil War mementos. He's a big Civil War historian. Muskets and knives, unsheathed knives, scary stuff all over the place. Westwood's turned around in his chair, and he is screaming into the phone. His secretary had said he's talking to his client, American Airlines. He says, "You stupid son of a something. If you guys do that, I'm going to fire you." That is the way he talked to everybody, including his clients, and they just ate it up. But here's Tagliabue, quivering on the other side. Finally, Westwood turns around in his chair, and he just stares at Tag and says, "I don't have a GD thing to say to you, you SOB. My wife and his wife are sitting over there, and I can't go further with this conversation." He's the most profane man that ever lived. He's a military drill instructor. And he paused, and he said, "I just wanted to see what an expletive-deleted Tagliabue would look like." And the last word out of his mouth was leave. Not a day later, Paul received an assignment to start out on some minor cause for the National Football League. It's been a heck of a ride, for it led to 17 years as the commissioner of the National Football League. It's been a great story in 5 categories, and I will do this very quickly. It has been a story of peace and prosperity, of diversity and public service, and credibility. Peace. That was tough to run that league for 17 years. There's a lot going on between the owners, and particularly between the players who wanted more money and the owners who wanted to make sure they didn't go broke. There was peace in the National Football League, if you remember. There were not big strikes. He didn't fight with his adversaries. He was asked to speak at the funeral of the head of the players' union. They were friends. And there was a lot of other peace. He decided not to be in court. It was great for our firm that we were in court. We had dozens of cases. He said, in those 17 years, we're going to take this out of the courts. Fights between players and the owners and all kinds of things. Prosperity. TV revenues grew from tenfold in those 17 years to $4.5 billion. The revenues of the clubs increased sevenfold to $6.5 billion. And the players did very well themselves, and they started to reach out overseas, the National Football League did. There have been games in Japan, in England, and other places. Diversity. He set in motion a program they called Deep and Diverse Pool of all applicants for head coaching jobs or other coaching jobs. There are black coaches. There are black assistant coaches in the National Football League. They have a number of diversity committees he established. One year, the Pro Bowl was supposed to be in Phoenix, and the owner had agreed they would honor Martin Luther King Day, and then he decided he wouldn't, and they pulled that. Super Bowl was not held in Phoenix. Public service, they contribute about $20 million a year to public service. They formed an alliance you've seen on television 100 times with United Way and the NFL making contributions and urging more. Credibility, and I end with this. Nobody ever yelled out, "You liar," to Paul Tagliabue or to the NFL. There have been fixing scandals we've all heard about in the NBA, in college basketball. Scandals have been a problem with sports. You didn't hear any scandals in those 17 It's been a heck of a ride. Thanks for coming.
I cannot start by telling you what Howard Westwood called Bob, but anyone who wants to know, just send me your email address. What I'm going to talk about today, I think, is really reflects what's going on in the world. That's extremely important in many, many areas, not just sports. It's globalization, and what does that mean? How do you put meat on that concept? And it also, I think, is a change in America's place in the world and America's perspective on the world. Until 1989, there was a Cold War, there was a Berlin Wall, there was a Warsaw Pact, there was the Soviet Union. That fell 20 years ago. India was a socialist state without a market economy, unaligned. That fell about 20 years ago. China was America's adversary, to put it mildly. That began to change when President Nixon and Henry Kissinger went to China in early 1970s. In the last 20 years, there have been extraordinary changes in China. So that's kind of the big context, and I thought I would take the big context down to sports and talk about, as the title implies, or the title says, the future of professional sports in the global marketplace. The first thing I think you need to do if you're going to be engaged as an individual or as an organization globally is to get out there and put your shoes on and walk in the streets of their neighborhoods and in the rural roads of countries around the world and understand their culture. So I did that when I was at the NFL. I tried as often as I could to get around the world. We had a league in Europe for a while. More than a dozen seasons, I was over there on many occasions to watch players from Japan, Mexico, France, Eastern Europe, England, and the United States play in that European league. We had preseason games, as Bob mentioned, not just in places like Tokyo, but in Sydney and in Berlin and Mexico City, in many different cultures and cities, in many different economic environments. We went to the World Cup matches. We went to Aussie Rules football games in Australia to understand their form of football and how it's embedded in not only in their psyche as a people, but in their geography. Since leaving the NFL 3 years ago, my wife and I have been traveling extensively, and not just as tourists, but as really engaged individuals, engaged in higher education, engaged in different business endeavors, including sports. I serve on Panasonic's Global Advisory Board, and we just finished meetings in Japan with global advisors from Brazil, Russia, India, China, Japan, and other parts of the world, talking about what's going on globally. To illustrate my point about getting out there and walking in the streets and rural roads around the world, in the last 3 years, if I have my list correct, my wife and I have been, I'll read it quickly, to Australia, Bhutan, China twice, India twice, Germany, Russia, Israel, Japan 3 or 4 times, Okinawa, Singapore, England 3 or 4 times, Italy, Greece, and Jordan and Qatar. And in all of those places, we've had conversations with people in education, business people in many different walks of life, NGOs, women in rural India working with micro-lending and things like that, as well as with people in sports. So I encourage everybody here at this time and place, and you'll see some illustrations in my remarks, to get out there and understand what's going on. I'm going to focus on really 3 things. One is globalization. What is it? What does it mean for America? Before I do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the qualities of sport and sports generally, and then I'll talk lastly about how sports are evolving in this global marketplace. From my perspective, I think the thing that really is important about sport is that it is so multi-dimensional. Obviously, it's entertainment. Obviously, it's athletic competition. But there are many things that are not so obvious about sport. In some contexts, it's education. Supreme Court Justice Byron White, who was not just the Supreme Court Justice, but a Rhodes Scholar and a great player in the NFL. While he was studying at Yale Law School, he was the highest paid player in the league and the best player in the league, probably in the late 30s and early 40s. He talked about football as the most important thing he ever did in his life, to teach him about work ethic, to teach him about commitment, to teach about overcoming adversity. And he said that football and other sports can give you the skill sets that you need in order to deal with the challenges of life. And then he added as an afterthought, and it's damn good fun to knock someone on their boop as well. So, but that's just one example of how it's education. It's culture, it's community, it's civic passion. You can just look at the place of the New Orleans Saints in New Orleans after Katrina, right up until this day, and not just the team, but the athletes. People like Drew Brees, who bought homes there and have been leading the rebuilding of the city. Over the decades in the United States, sports has been a window of opportunity for people to come from immigrant backgrounds and then from minority groups. And that still continues to be the case, whether it's football, basketball, boxing, or many other sports, to rise above difficult circumstances and create careers. Outside of the United States, sport has tremendous political dimensions. We played, as I mentioned, NFL preseason games in Berlin, starting less than a year after the wall came down in November of 1989. We were there in the summer of 1990 with an NFL game, I think the Rams and the Chiefs. And we had a meeting with the members of the Senate in Berlin talking about how American music, American literature, American sport, American culture would, over time, replace the American troops that had been in Berlin during the Cold War. And there was a lot of excitement at that time. And it ultimately produced the reunification of Germany. But one of the leaders of the Berlin Senate said to me something I never will forget. He said, America is always going to be critical in the minds of people here in Berlin because you saved not just our city, but now it's turning out you saved our nation. But do understand that the soccer league here was created in 1961 when the Berlin Wall was put up, and the British forces and the British government, which had one of the four quadrants of Berlin, created a soccer league to be an act of defiance toward the Soviet Union and to demonstrate to the Soviet Union that the people of Berlin would continue to do the things that people living in free societies do. So he said, this has got enormous political significance. It's going to take you decades, if not centuries, to overcome what soccer means here in Berlin. There's a recent book, and it's, sometimes I give speeches that become reading lists, but I won't overdo it. But it's a wonderful recent book called The Politics of Sport in Asia. And it's written by someone who was a National Security Council advisor, not just someone, a really distinguished Korean-American scholar. And he poses the question in this book as follows, with respect to the Berlin Olympics, the Beijing Olympics. Did China present itself as a responsible host and an emergent international power, as Japan did during the Tokyo Games in 1964 and as South Korea did during the 1988 Seoul Games? Or was Beijing in 2008 more like Berlin in 1936, when Germany took advantage of the global spotlight to promote its political ideology at home and abroad? And if you read this book, it's really amazing the number of incidents that have occurred in and among Asian countries around sport that have colored and become part of the relationship, sometimes strong and sometimes antagonistic, among those nations. There's another wonderful book called The Meaning of Sports. It's written by a professor of political science at Johns Hopkins. Some of you may have had him as an undergraduate. The subtitle of the book is Why Americans Watch Baseball, Football, and Basketball and What They See When They Do. And his argument is that sport in American society is an extraordinary piece of the culture And he talks about the three sports that he writes about, and he says this: each expresses part of the experience and some of the values of the wider society in which it is embedded. In particular, as this book describes, baseball, football, and basketball each reflect a particular era with distinctive social and economic arrangements through which the United States has passed. The agrarian, which is what he says baseball is about, the industrial, which is what he says football is about, and the post-industrial, which is what he says basketball is about. He also has some views about the place of sports in society as a surrogate for some of the eternal verities of religion. I won't go into that, but anyone who's interested in the meaning of sport should pick up this book and get it. So that's the context in which I look at sport. And I think it's the context that you have to understand if you're going to be involved in global sports. So let me turn to the next question. What is globalization? It's a big word. Sometimes it's maligned, sometimes it's praised. I think when you boil it all down, it's the cumulative impact of political and economic changes in some countries, starting maybe with China and India, and then to add to that the impact of technology and telecommunications, the internet, what I call the internet and digital revolutions. And all of that has contributed to the free flow of capital, to the free movement of talent, to the global movement of goods in an extraordinary way that is an entirely new phenomenon. Obviously, people like Tom Friedman have written about the world being flat. Others have written about the inevitable flow of power to the east. And so there's still a lot to understand and to determine about globalization. And of course, the global economic crisis has created a whole different perspective on globalization. Maybe it's not the ultimate economic system, and maybe those nations who insulated themselves from some of these developments fared better in the recent crisis than others. But bottom line, I think, is that in the 18th and 19th centuries, it was recognized, and historians have recognized, that Europe dominated the world both politically and economically. The Industrial Revolution, the development of nation states, colonial empires, for better or worse, they dominated huge parts of the globe. Then power and influence shifted in the 20th century to the United States, and the 20th century is frequently said to have been America's century. Now, what we're looking at, in my judgment, is something that's different. Fareed Zakaria, who's with Newsweek International, wonderfully brilliant public intellectual from India, has written that the 21st century right now is witnessing the third great shift in power in the modern era, which he defines as the last 3 centuries. He calls it the rise of the rest, not the rise of the East or of the West, the rise of the rest. It includes the rise of Asia, but he emphasizes that in 2006, 2007, which were the 2 years before he wrote his book, the economies of 124 countries, not just those of Asia, grew at a rate of more than 4% per annum. That is unprecedented in world history. These changes have produced new groupings of economies on a regional basis, on a global basis, and new acronyms. Most of us have heard about the BRIC countries: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. In my recent visit to Japan, we started talking about the MINT countries: Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. And all of these economies are experiencing this unprecedented, at least in the last 3 centuries, economic growth and improvements in the quality of life. So Zakaria goes on to say, what does it mean for America? It doesn't mean that the globe is going to become anti-American. It means that power in this, what he calls post-American world, is going to be shared by many nations and by many people. And I think that's clearly what's happening around the world. So if you're going to be part of the 21st century, you better be part of those dynamics. You know, the shift in power can be measured in extraordinary ways. There's one study that Goldman Sachs did, which is frequently cited, that shows that from between 2005 and 2030, basically, the so-called emerging market economies will grow from where they were a couple of years ago, 1/5 of the economies of the developed world, to become equal to the economies of the developed world. And given what's happened in the last 18 months, that might happen before 2030. So that's globalization generally. Let me talk a little bit about global sports and the NFL in that context. Sports are a piece of this phenomenon. As economies produce greater wealth, there's growing demand for services and products of all kinds, including entertainment, including sports. Just as important or more important, including education and higher education. So as I look at global sports, I don't see it as something separate from globalization. I see it as a microcosm, as an example of what's going on much more broadly. And you're going to have the good and the bad in global sports, just as you will have the good and the bad in the global economy generally. There are going to be nationalist impulses. There will be protectionist impulses. There are patriotic impulses. They all become manifested in different contexts in the global economy, including in sports. For me, one of the most interesting pieces of these phenomena is talent. You frequently, I'm in meetings with business people, education leaders and others, and in the context of globalization, two words are constantly uttered. One is talent, the other is innovation, and the two go together. The third would be education. When you look at global sports, what's happening is that there's an extraordinary loosening, an accelerated loosening of the free movement of talent around the world. European teams in England, in Holland, in Germany, in Italy, which were dominated in soccer by national athletes, are now dominated by athletes from many other parts of the world, including South America and Africa. So just as you see great software companies and great corporations of all kinds, great universities with the research institutions where there is talent from all over the world, you see the same phenomenon in sports. Just before the Beijing Olympics, The Economist, focused on talent in sports, made the same point in this way. Sport has clearly become a global business. What is new is the degree of commercialization and its spread to emerging markets. I think that's the first point. The second is this. Another sign is the international integration of sports labor markets. Brazilian footballers, for instance, turn up in leagues from the Faroe Islands to Vietnam. And so there are these examples in sports that you can find analogs for in other parts of the economy. In about a month, the NFL will play its third regular season game in London. They played one in each of the last 2 years. Every game has been sold out. I think they sell basically 50,000 tickets in 8 or 10 hours when they announce the ticket sales, and then it's sold out within 24 to 48 hours. More than 80,000 fans, mostly Brits, but a lot of Europeans actually come across the channel and go to these games. The thing they talk about is the talent, not just the Drew Breeses and the Eli Mannings and the Tom Bradys, but the O.C. Umenyuras and other players from around the globe who are now playing in the NFL. The Giants actually have a player who whose grandfather was Uganda's first prime minister and was assassinated by the forces of Idi Amin. That's a long way from the sources of talent of NFL players when you and I were dreaming about becoming NFL players. So it's just another example of this movement of talent. And what people are attracted to comes back to one of the attributes of sport, going all the way back to Greek times. The greatest athletes in the early Olympics were viewed as the superhumans. They were idolized as gods. And so what people are looking for is really the superhuman athletic performance. They see that in soccer. They see it in NFL football. They see it obviously in basketball. Teams like the Dream Team in the Barcelona Olympics with Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, had such a tremendous impact. Steffi Graf and Boris Becker had such a tremendous impact on tennis in Germany because they were seen as the first German tennis players who were in that superhuman category. So I think that's a piece of what you have to try to accomplish. I always say, what's the foundation of a great spectator sport? Is it the fact that a lot of people participate? Because if the answer to that is yes, then soccer is going to be the wave of the future. If the answer is that the appeal of a spectator sport is that the athletes are doing something that very few people can do, then you have a different answer. And I think to me, it's the latter. Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier, when they fought, their fights were watched by 1 billion people around the globe. It wasn't because it was mass participation in boxing. It was because they were the only two people in the world who were willing or able to do what they were doing. And I think the same is true to some degree of Michael Jordan. It's obviously a mix of multiple things. Participation is a piece of it. Understanding the event and the competition is a piece of it. But when it comes to being a spectator sport, a big piece of it is that the athletes doing it are the superhumans. This is happening all around the world. As I say, as the quality of life and as spending, disposable income increases. In India, my wife and I were there by coincidence a year and a half ago when they launched their new India Premier League in cricket. It was astonishing how a society with 1,200,000,000 people that had no sports, no professional sports just 10 years ago, all of a sudden had this incredible league that was becoming massively available on television with stadiums in the 8 biggest cities and spectator interest growing and interest among the kids in participating growing in incredible ways. The result of all this is that if you are looking for a career in this area, you'll find that you're competing with people from all over the world. I get a lot of calls from young people in sports, some in the NFL, some in college administrative positions, some in other leagues. And almost without fail, what they want to talk to me about is working in Eastern Europe or working in India or working in China in sports. Last year, before the NFL game in London, there was a conference of leading companies and individuals in global sports. And just give you an example of who was there trying to understand the dynamics of what I'm talking about. The CEO of International Rugby, the Commissioner of the NFL, the President of the International Equestrian Federation, which just hired one of the NFL's top young executives, the princess who represents the United Arab Emirates on the International Olympic Committee, the President of Real Madrid Soccer Club, the Commissioner of the Indian Cricket League, the Chairman of the London 2012 Olympic Committee, the owner of the Montreal Canadiens Hockey Club, which he recently sold, who also owns the Liverpool Soccer Club, and on it goes. And then from the media, Qualcomm, Sony India, Sony USA, Beijing Olympic Broadcasting Company, ESPN. All of these companies are involved in this global phenomenon. So when I look back to when I went to Georgetown on a basketball scholarship, which was 50 years ago, the changes have been incredible, but that's not the important thing. The important thing is if the changes were incredible in the last 50 years, when the pace of demographic and political and economic and technological change was much slower than it is now, you can only imagine what the pace of change is going to be in the future. When I was getting out of high school and going to Georgetown, 1958, 59, as I mentioned already, Europe was divided by the Iron Curtain. Everyone was excited about Sputnik. None of us had ever flown on airplanes, very few. Many of us were still, you may be surprised to learn there was such a thing, had telephones in our homes which were shared with our neighbors, so-called party lines. And you had to hear how many rings there were to know whether it was ringing your phone or your neighbor's phone or the tenant upstairs or the tenant in the basement. And if you didn't want to pay attention to those ground rules, you could listen to everybody's conversations. That's a long way from where we are today with the iPhone. And the iPhone's a long way from where phones were just 5 or 10 years ago. So these changes are taking place at an incredibly rapid pace. Look at the demographics. We have roughly 325 million people. There are more than 6 billion. That's 6,000 million. 6,000 million other people in the world compared to our 350 or 325 million. They all are competing. They all are succeeding. They are all pursuing, for the most part, the same types of dreams, the same types of ambitions, and the same types of interests that you all are pursuing. Bring it closer to home for you. When you finish law school in 2015, hopefully you finish before then, but by 2015, you'll still be in the early part of your career. Still be in the first 10 years of your professional career, hopefully with 40, 50, 60, 70 years to go, depending on how life expectancy grows. By 2015, there'll be 2.8 billion people living in China and India, 8 times the population of the United States. And their economy will be coming closer and closer in scale and complexity and sophistication to ours. And so that's just the threshold of the world that you'll be entering into. Everyone is obviously connected now, and this is a big part of the globalization of sports. Websites. 20 years ago, when I was first commissioner, I used to go to Europe. There were no websites. You talked about American sport. You talked about the BBC, or in Italy, you talked about one of the 2 government-owned television channels. Now they're the Berlusconi/government-owned television channels. But they didn't pay attention to sports outside of England or Italy. Today, you go to Madrid, and the hottest and best designed website is about NFL. You can go to Turkey. You can go almost anywhere in the world. True story. This tops the Westwood story. When I was in Japan 2 weeks ago, at the end of this 3-day meeting of Panasonic's Global Advisory Board, we were taken to an 1,100-year-old Buddhist monastery in Kyoto. And we were given a tour and lectured to by the abbot of the monastery. And then we were treated to dinner in this 1,100-year-old building. We were served by monks. Other monks joined us for dinner, our group. About 2/3 of the way through the meal, the monk who was serving me, and we were sitting on very low stools and they were kneeling, he leaned forward to me like this. I was here and he was there, and he said, "I know who you are." So I said, "Really? I know who I am too." But he said, "You're the former NFL commissioner." He said, "I've been in here for 15 years, but when you first started playing games in Japan, I was madly in love with the 49ers. I was a huge NFL fan, went to all your games." He's a Buddhist monk. Then he says, "If you don't mind, can I take 1 more minute of your time?" He pulled up his garment, and he had his Steeler logoed watch. He said, "When Montana retired, I switched to the Steelers." That's where the world is. But the world is only there because of this incredible technological revolution. The internet, the capacity of servers, the ability to archive data and to move it around. And obviously, as that's evolving, we're getting into social networks and all kinds of communications that weren't dreamed of even 5 years ago. In American sport, when I was entering Georgetown, the furthest west baseball teams were in St. Louis and Chicago. Saylor grew up in Kansas, although the teams were east of Kansas. That was until the late 50s. Now, Major League Baseball draws a huge part of its talent from Japan. We all know that. You don't have to be a huge fan to know about all the great Japanese baseball players. Japanese newspapers, I picked one up when I was over there, they now speak in the following way about Major League Baseball in the United States. Today, quote, "Today in our borderless world, Japanese baseball fans don't care where Japanese stars play, just so long as they can see it on cable or download it onto their iPods." The recently retired ambassador of Japan to the United States went home to take a major position in Japan. He's the new commissioner of baseball. So it kind of illustrates the place of sport in this global environment. Obviously, the NBA is in the forefront as a leader. Players last season from 32 different countries, probably 75, 85 players, including a lot of the greatest players in the league. But there's still this element, this hybrid element of interest, and the sources of interest are still complex to identify. Is it the fact that the athletes are ours? Is it because China has Yao Ming? Is tennis popular when German tennis fans have Boris Becker and Steffi Graf? Fernando Valenzuela did amazing things for baseball and for Mexican interest in U.S. baseball when he played for the LA Dodgers. Or to what extent is it celebrity? When we were at the basketball competition in Beijing last summer, we went to both men's and women's games. I should have brought it. I have a photograph of a young Chinese fan draped in the most nationalistic way in China's flag, sporting pins of Chairman Mao and little flags emblazoned onto his cheeks. When I asked him if I could take his picture, because I thought he was the greatest example of excess zeal and nationalism, he said yes, and he went like this, and he was wearing Kobe Bryant's jersey. So he had Mao on his hat and Kobe Bryant here. I never did see what he was wearing for trousers, but I don't know what it was. It wasn't David Stern's trousers, I know that. So where does all this go, and how do you become part of it? Like I said, I think whether it's sports or education or the computer industry or the life sciences or the law, or whatever you're doing, you better get out there and understand all of this that's going on. I could give you another lecture about the global competition for legal services, but you probably don't want to hear about that because the competition for legal services in the United States is rigorous enough. I understand that. But how do I look at the future? I think I look at the future through 4 different lenses, or one lens that focuses on 4 different things. First of all, I think those who succeed in this marketplace have to bring their best product around the world. That's what the NFL's doing with games in London. They'll probably play some regular season games at some point soon on the continent, maybe in Germany, maybe elsewhere on the continent. So you have to bring your best product and your best athletes. You still have to bring those people that fans can say are superhuman. This year they're bringing the Patriots with Tom Brady. And you have to deal with what I call the everyone can do it versus only a few can do it phenomenon, the Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier example. When people ask me why I think soccer's had such a difficult time succeeding in the United States, there's a complicated answer. There's also a short answer. They sell the game on the basis that everyone can do it. And if everyone can do something, not a lot of other people want to watch. Everyone can jog, but you don't have a big spectator audience for jogging. So, but you got to bring your superhumans and get out there with your best product. Secondly, you have to, on the other end of the spectrum, foster participation. Soccer's benefited enormously from the global competition that's the World Cup. The NBA has benefited enormously from the global competition that is the Olympics. The NFL and Major League Baseball, just to take 2 sports, have not benefited from those kinds of global competitions because they don't exist for the most part in football and baseball. The NHL takes advantage of it in the Winter Olympics. So that was the genesis of the NFL league in Europe. If the Olympic committees in Europe were not going to create American football leagues, then I felt the NFL had to do it itself. And I still think at some point, leagues in Europe, leagues in Mexico, support of the Canadian League is important because you have to have participation. You have to have indigenous athletes coming up to play the game. Ultimately, people want to cheer for athletes they know in most contexts, and not for athletes that they regard as, Hessians coming in to do battle. there has to be ownership in many ways, that people have to feel they own the athletes, that they understand them, that they identify with them, but just as important, they have to feel that the team is theirs. Someone in basketball recently told me that all the surveys that have been done in Europe about American sports in Europe, the one area where the NFL was always number one was that in the NFL Europe League, we had a Frankfurt team with the Frankfurt Galaxy had their own fans. We had teams in Berlin. They had their own teams. They had very few of their own athletes. There were some German players who played in the NFL. There were some French players who played in the NFL. But they did have their own team, and when the league plays its game in London at the end of October, probably 20% of the crowd will be wearing Frankfurt Galaxy, Berlin Thunder, NFL Europe League paraphernalia, and with the names of players who played over there, including Kurt Warner, who was in the early days of that league, the MVP. So where do you come to with the last piece of sport, which is all the ancillary stuff around it? The Faith Hill concert before the game, the Rolling Stones at halftime. I think it's there. It's an element of appeal. At one point, American culture, American film, Hollywood, American fiction drove interest around the world, much less so. The biggest producers of television programming today in the world are Mexican and Indian companies in their languages and in their cultural context. So I think that all the ancillary stuff and what drives culture in Asia, it's probably what happens in Shanghai and Seoul and not what happens in Cincinnati, which doesn't begin with an S, but sounds like an S. I think the best athletes, participation, ownership, in the broadest sense, in quotes, are the critical things. Ancillary entertainment, I don't know where it fits. When we first played a few games in Berlin, we had great crowds, even though no one could throw a football, they never could make it spin. They didn't know which end was up. They didn't realize neither end is up. And we had so many ancillary elements with great European rock groups, and even my nephew came to the game because he was a huge fan of MTV Europe. And we also had dogs chasing frisbees, on the sidelines, just so people could be interested during the timeouts. And as we were leaving the game, one of the smart Alex who works for the NFL made a comment to me which has always posed the question about growing sports globally. He said, I can see these German fans going home right now on the Strassenbahn. They're saying, I get it, the field goal is 3 points, touchdown is 6 points, extra point is 1. But how many points do they get when that dog catches the frisbee? Because there was more of that than there was of other scoring. So that's kind of my perspective. If you can figure out the answers to all of those riddles and all of those dynamics, some of which are consistent with each other and reinforce each other, and some of which conflict with each other and cancel out each other, then you'll have a great career in global sports.